Unpacking the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs. We're going to preview President Trump's State of the Union, what we're looking for and what we expect in the response from Democrats. And Gavin Newsom sticks his foot in his mouth once again. All of that and so much more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
First this week, we go to the Olympics, where the men's hockey team from the United States took home gold.
Watch across it comes. Jack Hughes wins it. The golden goal for the United States.
It was an incredible moment. I don't want to say I watched it because I was in church when the winning goal happened, but it was incredible, and I think everyone enjoyed unpacking that over the next couple days. That happened just days after the women's hockey team won their own gold medal. This is the first time in history the same country has won gold for both men's and women's hockey, and it closes off a historic Olympic Games. The Americans bring home the most gold medals they have ever won in a single Winter Olympic Games. Also over the weekend, crazy news out of Mexico. The Mexican government took out cartel boss Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, in an operation that the Americans supported. But it has led to an outbreak of violence between the cartel and the Mexican government. Also down in Palm Beach, another potential assassination attempt against President Trump was thwarted at Mar-a-Lago.
Raised the shotgun to a shooting position. At that point in time, the deputy and the two Secret Service agents fired their weapons and neutralized the threat.
Fortunately, President Trump was not at Mar-a-Lago. He was in Washington, D.C. at the time of this event. But this is the third very dangerous assassination attempt against President Trump. But first today, we're going to talk about his State of the Union address. Tonight will be the first State of the Union address of his new term. This State of the Union address comes at a very important time for President Trump. There are lots of things going on in foreign policy, on the international stage. It's also a midterm year, and the State of the Union address at the beginning of a midterm year is normally a time for a president to recenter on their priorities that they want to convey most to voters. It also is the 250th anniversary of America's founding, and so I expect we're going to see a lot of patriotic themes throughout. But to lay out what I'm looking for, here are a number of topics that I think President Trump is going to focus on. First and foremost, affordability. President Trump is balancing the need to take victory laps for things that he's done in the Big Beautiful Bill, in the biggest deregulatory agenda of all time that has been the center point of driving down costs for so many things, from energy to housing to everything in our lives, while also making sure he's not falling into the Biden trap of sounding like everything is perfect and you're doing great. That's the balancing act that he faces. There are a lot of positive signs. There's a lot of positive economic indicators they can point to, but until people feel those things, it's not going to shift the larger polling picture. In this State of the Union address, he can continue to draw out those important breadcrumbs for people to follow that will help them see positive things in their own lives, particularly things like a $1,000 increase in their tax returns, increased take-home pay, things like that. But again, it's important to not have a sort of mission accomplished air, but more of a we are on our way there. He's going to talk about immigration because even though the border being secure is something that he did right away, it goes to a theme that President Trump has talked about, which is all we needed was a new president and the border is secure. Immigration continues to be a priority for both this administration, but also for American voters. Another major topic that I do expect that we'll hear quite a bit about is his healthcare agenda. And one issue that he's talked about on that is price transparency and the importance of forcing hospitals and insurance companies to show people how much they're going to be paying for things before they get care. I expect he's going to talk quite a bit about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, and everywhere from our healthcare system to the entire rest of our government, where we know trillions of dollars are disappearing every year without any accountability for it. I expect that he's going to also talk about foreign policy. This week, we're expecting to hear new peace talks about the ongoing situation in Iran. Meanwhile, President Trump has continued to move assets into the region to ratchet up pressure as they carry out these negotiations. Another issue that he will likely tout wins is the issue of public safety. The areas that he has sent in the National Guard have seen drastic drops in crime. Some of that's also related to the immigration enforcement and trying to remove dangerous criminal illegal immigrants. But another topic that I think will probably get some airtime will be the issue of tariffs. We're going to unpack the Supreme Court's decision in our next block. But one thing that I think I'll be watching very closely is how much time President Trump spends on that. If he spends a good amount of this speech attacking the Supreme Court, talking about this issue that has divided Republicans. A number of Republicans on Capitol Hill in multiple instances have voted against these tariffs. The more time President Trump spends on those more divided issues, the more likely the media is going to report on this State of the Union as an airing of grievances and less on a positive vision for President Trump and Republicans going into the midterms. One dynamic to watch during the State of the Union is the role of Democrats. A number of Democrats have already announced they'll be boycotting the speech entirely, which I can't imagine President Trump is too upset about. People like Adam Schiff will not be in the room. Who knows what they'll be doing outside, some sort of theatrical antics with dark money groups. Abigail Spanberger, the governor of Virginia, that we've talked about quite a bit here, will be delivering the official response for the Democrats. I think that is helpful because Abigail Spanberger sets up an incredibly valuable contrast for voters. We already see in Virginia what Democrats are going to do if they get in power. They're going to talk about 50 new taxes. They're going to talk about lowering the threshold for crime laws to allow violent criminals back on the street. They're going to do things like bar ICE from working with local law enforcement to remove dangerous criminal illegal immigrants. They're going to do things like try and confiscate our guns. So having Abigail Spanberger, the face of the left's radicalization, deliver the response is actually quite helpful. At the same time, there's brand new polling that shows that her redistricting plan to cancel out 4 Republican districts, something we talked about extensively last week, is actually deeply unpopular. By an 8-point margin, 52 to 44%, Virginians prefer the current maps in the current redistricting system.
Look, Virginia's current congressional map has been bipartisanly rated as one of the most fair maps in the entire country.
So while Spanberger is leading the intellectual sort of rebellion from the left, you also have a number of Democrats who have made clear their entire North Star is to do whatever they can to get attention opposing President Trump. For example, here's California gubernatorial candidate Katie Porter with her entire campaign message in one whiteboard.
That's right! Trump!
So that is Katie Porter, who's among the top 3 Democrats in the current race for governor to replace Gavin Newsom in California. She's most famous for dumping boiling mashed potatoes on her ex-husband's head or for screaming at staffers.
And other problems, and the state could lose. Get out of my fucking shot.
And her sign, F Trump, which you couldn't see because we blurred that out because this is a family show, is the entirety of most Democrats' agenda. They don't have any kind of affordability plan on their own. Their entire plan is to simply run against President Trump. Gavin Newsom was on CNN over the weekend, and he got pushed on this very specific issue.
California has the highest cost of living in the nation. The state's prices are 11% higher than the national average. We were actually out to dinner here in Nashville last night. We met a couple from California. Yeah. They moved out of California because they couldn't afford the rent or even to buy a home and also start a family.
So again, how are you going to take Gavin Newsom and Democrats seriously as a contrast to President Trump on affordability when they have made their states completely unlivable while they're also sending hundreds of billions of your tax dollars into fraud schemes that make their own friends a little bit richer? But also consider other people in that sort of Democrat, murderers row list of talent. AOC, we talked about her in Munich over the weekend. She tried to kind of defend herself and push back, and it went about exactly as you'd expect.
I'm afraid the issue's not my understanding, but rather the problem is perhaps you've gotten adjusted to a president that never thinks before he speaks.
With the theme, we should have all expected that AOC would blame her flubs and the fact that she couldn't give very basic answers on the most important foreign policy issues of our time at a security conference. She would blame it on President Trump. We should have expected that. That goes on theme and on brand. But again, she is supposed to be one of the intellectual leaders of the left in America right now. If President Trump can make this State of the Union speech and our march to the midterms a contrast between Republicans having actual plans and showing creative solutions on issues like affordability and the problems that people are feeling today, with Democrats who are best embodied by Zoran's warmth of collectivism, where people are dying, freezing in the streets with garbage piled up everywhere. Places like Washington, D.C., with rivers of human waste, while every Democrat points at each other and says, actually, it's their fault. Or Gavin Newsom with tent cities, with hundreds of billions of dollars in fraud that isn't helping anybody. If Republicans can draw that contrast, they'll win in the midterms and President Trump will have an incredibly positive State of the Union address. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here is CNN's Fareed Zakaria.
For Democrats in city halls, there is a choice. Stop governing as if the goal is to announce new entitlements and instead make government work.
Last week, the Supreme Court delivered their long-awaited ruling on President Trump's tariffs.
This law that grants the president emergency powers did not, it looks like by this first blush reading by the Chief Justice here, does not give him the power to levy these tariffs that he's levied.
Now, as Shannon's describing in that clip, this ruling is not simple. It is a very, very complex issue that the Supreme Court was taking on there. But what they did find is that President Trump did not have the authority to use this particular classification of tariffs the way that he did. And so they're going to have to go to the drawing board. But also in Justice Kavanaugh's ruling, he described a number of other tools President Trump has at his disposal to levy these tariffs. But for me, having watched this case and listened to the oral arguments, one area where I feel like this really started to show that it was going off the rails was in oral arguments when Justice Gorsuch asked the Trump attorneys, John Sauer in this case, if this would allow a future president to use tariffs in the case of a climate emergency. And the Trump administration was required to say, yes, it would. Another instance in that same oral argument was when President Biden's use of the COVID emergency for student loan bailouts was discussed. And the fact that this Supreme Court has given a fair amount of deference to the executive branch on a number of issues, but in emergency use cases, they are generally fairly skeptical on whether something's actually an emergency or whether something fits the classification applied for in an emergency situation. I'd encourage everybody to read particularly Justice Gorsuch's opinion about the separation of powers and the fact that the legislative process exists the way that it does for a reason. And the legislative process is the tool by which a president needs to use for most tariffs. And there are other tools the president can use, as we talked about, and he's already planning on some of those for more universal tariffs around the world. But the bottom line here is so much of President Trump's agenda relies on taking power away from the executive branch, like he did by getting rid of the endangerment finding, which gave the EPA power to pass without Congress crippling regulations on energy. We've talked about Chevron deference, the tool previously that allowed the executive branch to have the major power over regulations. They got rid of that, which allowed President Trump to get rid of a lot of regulations, saying Congress needs to be the one to pass major rules and regulations. Another major breaking news piece from the Supreme Court yesterday. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal by Exxon and Suncor Energy in an industry bid to stop dozens of city and state lawsuits that blame oil companies for climate change. We've talked a lot here on 10-Minute Drill about how the left has moved to the courts to try and move their climate policy, particularly trying to destroy the fossil fuel industry that they know they can't really get rid of through the normal legislative process. And so, in cities and states around the country, left-wing dark money groups, in some cases funded by the Chinese Communist Party, have been suing energy companies to try and basically blame them for bad weather events that they say amount to localized damage from climate change. These are insane cases. We've talked about one in Honolulu where the government is arguing that sea level rises are the result of these energy companies and people, filling up their car with gas and things like that. There's no actual scientific attribution established for what they're doing here, but they have tried to basically carry this out through a shell game in cities and states around the country. And so the Boulder case that we've also talked a little bit about here, where this sweet little, mayor of Boulder, who doesn't actually know anything, is the face of a major climate suit against energy companies saying Boulder has experienced extreme weather because of these energy companies. The Supreme Court is going to weigh in on this case because this doesn't just affect Boulder and it doesn't just affect Colorado. It's impossible to actually say localized damage from weather events is anyone in particular's fault. That's crazy. But again, this is the left-wing dark money universe's shell game to try and destroy energy and try and force people into more, electric cars, more wind and solar panels and things like that. So we will follow this very closely, but it is a huge, huge development that the Supreme Court is going to review this case. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, we have an incredible nugget from Gavin Newsom. Now, Gavin Newsom's new book is coming out, so he's going on tour to sell it. At an event in Atlanta to a largely African-American crowd, he was trying to show some commonality, and he said this.
Just trying to impress upon you, I'm like you. I'm no better than you. But literally a 960 SAT guy, I cannot, you've never seen me read a speech because I cannot read a speech.
So again, Gavin Newsom thinks the best way to build a bridge with an audience is to say, I'm dumb too, which isn't going to go over very well. But it does remind me of this other quote that we heard from New York Governor Kathy Hochul.
Young black kids growing up in the Bronx who don't even know what the word computer is. They don't know. They don't know these things.
There's no one more guilty of the soft bigotry of low expectations than your average white Democrat. But one of the most interesting responses to this clip is from Nicki Minaj. His way of bonding with black people is to tell them how stupid he is and that he can't read. This means my first read on him was correct. He's been handed so many things and put in high positions he's never earned or deserved. He's not just telling them that they're all stupid and probably can't read. He's literally slowing down his speech to make them understand the words that are coming out of his mouth as if they're children. Now, just for icing on the cake, look at how empty this room is. Good luck to Gavin. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. We will have a special State of the Union response first thing on Wednesday morning. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.